I'll have some questions here shortly. We'll open up to the audience, but I know Mr. Loevy wanted to respond to some other panelists, and I'll open it up to others if they want to have a brief time to respond as well.
Let me make some general observations. For people that care about what is going on in this country, there is no one that I heard on this panel that has vilified police. To hold police responsible, to ask that they be held responsible for what happens in every community, our sons, our grandsons, our daughters, our granddaughters, does not mean that they are being vilified. Big difference between being held responsible and vilification. I feel strongly about that because these are issues that we've dealt with for both me and my family and our law firm deals with all of the time. To criticize is not to vilify. To ask that things can be done better by police officers and by police departments. That part of our world can be done and it can be accomplished. It cannot be accomplished if every time that a police officer engages in either an unlawful or a wrongful act, that he is automatically and without thinking told that he is right and he has done the wrong thing. Policemen, police departments make mistakes too. Our job as citizens is certainly to do much of what has been spoken of by the last speaker, but our job also is to see that policemen and police departments operate in such a manner as to be responsible to the communities and the citizens who they serve.
Okay, can I respond to that, please?
Yes.
All right.
Go ahead.
A couple of things, and I didn't get a chance to read off some data that I had prepared. I spent all this time researching, and I didn't get a chance to say it. I started to talk about Amnesty International, ACLU. Now, these are very hallowed civil liberties organizations worldwide. I mean, they were considered the gold standard. And I started to talk about in Oklahoma, after the Oklahoma City bombing, they said, and this was 9 years later in a human rights report, they talked about Timothy McVeigh being allowed to flee while law enforcement was looking for Arab terrorists. Okay, ACLU, again, said the same thing. What they did, however, was they repeated media claims. They repeated newspaper reports. They were not the facts. The facts were that Clint Van Zandt, an FBI profiler, immediately had profiled the bomber at Oklahoma City as a white male with military experience, probably a militia member. Okay? Within 24 hours, the FBI had the actual and they had identified McVeigh. 48 hours, McVeigh was already in custody, by the way. He had been taken into custody on a minor traffic violation. He was driving down the road without a license, which we know a lot of civil liberties people, they don't like those minor traffic violation stops. He was stopped on a minor traffic violation. The officer noticed he had a Glock and a suicide vest, and for all of those who don't know what a suicide holster, if you don't know what a suicide holster is, it's one that's got a big flap, and it's called such because if by the time you reach over and open it and draw, you're going to get killed, so they call it a suicide holster. He had already been taken into custody. The FBI in 48 hours had him arraigned at an air base in Oklahoma. But 9 years later, the ACLU and the Amnesty International, the premier civil liberties organizations, were repeating a false assertion. Okay? So the idea that police aren't vilified, well, they're vilified in a sense just by putting out false data. I know people who insisted, even after Darren Wilson had been exonerated by the grand jury, well, grand juries are sympathetic to police and they're not going to indict anybody. Well, how do you know this? I could just as easily say that the reason why cities get sued and there's a lot of these high dollar judgments are awarded is because you find jurors who are sympathetic to plaintiffs. I think they call it the Bronx jury effect, if anybody's familiar with that term. Okay, where, plaintiffs' lawyers, the trial lawyers go out and they find a sympathetic jury. I know doctors complain about this all the time. So I could just as easily say that as someone can say, well, the grand juries are sympathetic to police. The fact of the matter is, I work with people who are indicted, so I know better than anybody here how bad police officers can be. And anybody wants to Google the names Stevie Montevergine or Grover Dinwiddie, please do so, and you will see guys I worked with, who wound up going to jail, okay? And in fact, my cousin made the case against one of them. He called me up one night. He said, Mike, you know Grover Dinwiddie? I said, yeah. He goes, what do you think of him? I said, he's a nice guy. I said, oh, okay. He goes, well, I just want to get an idea. I said, well, what's going on, Tom? And he told me he was shaking down number writers. Now, for all those who don't know what a number writer is a bookie. Okay, he takes bets on lottery, for the illegal lottery. So I know that there is an effort. Nobody wants a bad officer. I don't like the cops that I work with are bad. I don't like the cops that are brutal. Nobody in my family liked them. None of my friends liked them. Nobody wants them. They're bad. They're bad for us. They were bad for the police. They're bad for society in general. Nobody likes them. Now, if there needs to be reforms made within the system to make sure that they're prosecuted, I'm not going to argue about that. I'll be the first one there to help you out doing that. But I'll believe that people are interested in criminal justice reform when trial lawyers start suing rapists on behalf of rape victims, which doesn't seem to happen, okay? I'll be real happy when people, instead of having police misconduct websites, they have websites about parole boards that release violent criminals, murderers even, because 9%, by the way, of all people in death row right now, 9% have a prior homicide conviction. I don't know how many of you know that. 9% have a prior homicide conviction. Think about that. Okay, you get 2 murders, okay? All right. When people start having websites that say, let's take a look at how many people, violent felons, murderers who have been paroled, who kill again, that's when I'll believe that they're in criminal justice reform, because as a police officer, you get sick and tired of locking up the same people over and over again. And forgive me, my wife tells me I have a Philadelphia accent, and sometimes if you misunderstand me, please just ask me to repeat myself, because I do have a heavy Philadelphia accent, I know that. And when I get emotional sometimes, it happens. But that's when I'll believe that people are interested in reform. Okay, when they start doing those types of things.
Yeah, just a quick comment. What bothers me, I guess, in terms of the outrage and the lawsuits are usually very selective. The very fact that Newark has been under Justice Department supervision for the last 5 years for police misconduct. But we talk about Ferguson. In the 90s, under Eric Holder, when he was the U.S. Attorney here, we had more police officers shooting citizens in Washington than any other place in the country, but no lawsuits, no public condemnation of that. Evil has to wear a white face before it finds its challenge, and that is detrimental to the people that we serve in those communities. That's my point about vilifying the police. It always has to be a racial dimension to it.
Can I just make a quick comment? I understand what you're saying. I live in Chicago, and we all know about the level of crime that's going on there. But the statistics, the actual statistics, are sometimes very surprising, because in the black community, the same level of deaths have been going on for many years. You know what the big difference, really big difference in my generation was? Used to be an African-American child was murdered in Chicago, killed by gunfire. You were lucky if it got 2 lines on the 20th page. What's happened, and it's a better thing, is that African-Americans getting killed is now newsworthy. I grew up in an era when it wasn't newsworthy, or to the extent that it was just a little blurb. Now when it happens, at least there is public attention being called to it. The solutions are complex. I admire what you're doing in terms of trying to get solutions. But bear in mind that at least today, as opposed to 20, 30, 40 years ago, there is publicity given, reportage given to black-on-black crime. Didn't exist a generation ago in the big cities. That's my point.
All right, let me give you some statistics. Numerous studies dating back 40 years have determined that the best predictor of use of force is the attitude of the suspect. As one professor once told me, in general, if the suspect is acting nastily, he will be treated nastily. A study by Boston University professor Robert Brown and University of Cincinnati criminologist James Frank found, in general, white officers are more likely to arrest suspects than black officers, but black suspects were more likely to be arrested when the decision maker was a black officer. According to the BJS, Bureau of Justice Statistics, from 76 to 98, young black males pardon me, murdered police officers at a rate almost 6 times higher than that of young white males. According to the FBI data, blacks were 43% of the known killers of law enforcement officers during the period 2004 to 2013. According to the arrest-related deaths report, which is a congressionally mandated report, and I know Tim had said that there is no data, or I thought you said that, but there is data collected by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, and it is this arrest-related deaths report. Excuse me. It says that nearly 2/3 of police shootings from 1980 to 2008 are intra-racial. Black officer, black suspect, white officer, white suspect. It's also worth noting that 3/4 of justifiable homicides by civilians are also intra-racial. A white person defending himself or whatever shooting a white criminal, a black civilian shooting a black criminal. So, and then also, this is another interesting statistic. According to the University of Chicago's prestigious National Opinion Research Center, General Social Survey, and if you're any social scientists, you're used to that report, 12.8% of Americans in 2012 don't think police officers should defend themselves even when being assaulted. Now think about that. This figure has increased dramatically from 3.1% about 40 years ago. For 2008, 64% of the justifiable homicides by police involved the officer being assaulted. For those involving citizens, 41% involved in assault against a citizen. And another arrest-related death report, which again is a congressionally mandated report, I think it goes back to the mid-90s. The Bureau of Justice Statistics determined that of 4,813 arrest-related deaths reported from 2003 to 2009, about 6 in 10 were classified as homicide by law enforcement personnel. The racial breakdown for blacks and whites indicated that 60.9% of whites and 61.3% of blacks were killed while being arrested during this period. The FBI estimated during these same 7 years, state and local law enforcement officers made nearly 98 million arrests. This means that only 3 out of 1 every 100,000 arrests result in someone being killed by police. According to one source I contact, that's about, you've got a 4 times greater chance of being electrocuted than being killed by police. Now, one final thing, and it's an encouraging statistic, that is that despite all the negative media, a 2011 Bureau of Justice Statistics study determined that 93% of persons requesting police assistance felt the officers acted properly. What's even more revealing is that there was no statistical difference found between the percentage of Hispanics, blacks, and whites. So, going back to what Orwell said, it seems the average person does not believe the misinformation campaign. But it's important to note that this data is out there. It is not being reported in the media. As Bob says, you're only getting, when it fits a certain narrative of a white officer and a black, that's what you're getting. You're not getting all the information. Now, you can quibble about it, you can debate it, you can, refute it, you can do anything you want with it. You can argue it, you can say what I'm saying is incorrect, or what the government says is incorrect, or it's incomplete, or whatever. But the fact is, it's not known. And there's too much misinformation, and I would suggest, in some cases, disinformation that is out there about police work.
Now, I want to turn to some specific reform measures, and hopefully we're going to try to leave about 25 minutes for questions from the audience. But one, I was recently at a conference for state Supreme Court justices, and we saw a program on the use of body cameras by officers. I know, Mr. Lynch, you mentioned this, and it's really amazing technology. Some of them, although they're quite expensive, include infrared technology to see things in not well-lighted situations. And I'm wondering what you think, Mr. Lynch, and others on the panel, about the proliferation, potentially, of body cameras, and whether that's a good or bad development.
Well, it's not a panacea, but I think it's going to be a big improvement in police work, and it's going to be the best friend to honest police officers. They're the ones that are going to be able to show that the stop was legitimate, the detention was legitimate, and the use of force that may be necessary in some circumstances was legitimate. It's going to be the enemy to the bad officers, the ones who are abusing their power. Now, we just published a study at Cato on police cameras, body cameras, identifying some best practices, because it's easy to, what we're hearing the past few months is spending money, giving them to police officers and getting them on their uniforms. But the issues get a little bit more complicated about what you're going to do with the footage once the police department is holding the information. Should it be disclosed in all circumstances, some circumstances? And it can be very expensive if you're going to like blur out the faces of certain like witnesses who may have been in public near the person being arrested. So these are some of the complicating issues surrounding body cameras. But the politicians are all over them. When the issues of police misconduct come up, it's their first go-to reform. Let's spend money on body cameras, because they don't want to discuss these issues. So they just body cameras, and then they want to move on with the discussion. But we're moving into a new era where people have their cell phones at the ready, and we're catching more and more police interactions with the public with smartphones. And this is a big difference from, a generation ago, because in the past, when somebody was complaining about excessive force with the police, and the police department denies it and just said, the officer used the force that was necessary. For those of us in the public, we didn't know what to make of it. We weren't there. We don't know the people involved. You don't want to think that the officer is fibbing. So we didn't know what to make of it. But now that more and more footage is becoming available, we can reach our own conclusions about what had happened, whether or not the officer used excessive force or whether he was defending himself. And this is kind of like the new thing that's going on, and it's not going to stop. We've got more citizens with their smartphones, and we've got police wearing body cameras.
All right, Mr. Woodson, do you have something
Yeah,
to say?
just a quick note. I mean, again, there's not a single perspective on this. A lot of the homicides, a lot of crimes that are closed in neighborhoods occurs because people come to the police and report to that police officer something that they have seen, or provide evidence that allows them to make an arrest. They're not going to be inclined to do that if they know they're going to be recorded. They're not going to want to cooperate like that. So, I mean, and I think we need to balance the accountability issue against law enforcement effectiveness and closing homicides and crimes.
I agree. It's a complicated issue. It's more nuanced than many people are acknowledging now in the media. So I agree with you.
But we need to discuss it from the point of view always on both sides of it. And when I talked about the vilification of police, that's my point. Whenever we talk about the police, I hear it, it's always, how can we prevent these bad people from doing bad things? That's the message that keeps coming across.
And the other issue, too, is how do you, through the filter of a tendentious media, that's really only out to crucify, for lack of a better term, crucify a police officer. I mean, it generates controversy. They sell papers. Whatever their motivations are. That's the other thing you have to look at. Look, this may be the only thing you and I concur on today, Tim, is that the police cameras are good, but if, as Bob says, if it's going to intimidate people, if it's going to be used by a tendentious media or tendentious scholars only to justify what they want to present, which is a racist white killer cop, it's not going to be any good. I mean, I alluded to in my presentation an arrest I made of a guy that was twice my size, who was basically trying to pound his wife's head into the sidewalk because she had an affair and he was mad at her. And, it came out as a call for a rape, but as soon as I pulled up, I realized it was just a domestic dispute, not a rape. I had to dislodge this guy, okay? And he's on top of her and he's sitting her, so I tried to push him. It didn't work. I got my nightstick and I put it up under his neck, under his chin, and I lifted up. And we both went up. And we both fell back, and then we recovered. I got my nightstick. He's coming at me at about 90 miles an hour, and I'm ready to hit him with my stick, and the wife grabs my nightstick. Now, supposing in that arrest, I would have crushed his larynx or something. Supposing I would have killed him by lifting him up under his neck. Didn't intend to do it, but do you think the wife, who probably would get, probably contact somebody like Mr. Loevy and want to sue for millions and millions of dollars, do you think she's going to say she was in danger? No. All right? She didn't even want me to hit him after I rescued her from having, multiple concussions or contusions or whatever. And that's the type of thing that goes on. And I guarantee if that's filmed, what excerpts are you going to see on the news? Are you going to see anything that led to this? Are you going to see what motivated my actions to get this guy and do what I did to try to dislodge him from her, to protect her? I don't know. I don't think so sometimes.
I want to give Mr. Loevy
I'm really disappointed to hear Mike say that the only thing that we can agree on is the police camera issue. I agree with you. There's been a lot of media distortion with the racial narrative, but I laid out about 6 or 7 policy proposals. These clauses in settlements that says victims can't speak out. Municipal court reform, turning police officers into revenue agents, keeping a tally of in-custody deaths, keeping a tally. We should know how many people are killed by the police officers each year, cutting out red tape to allow police chiefs to get rid of problem officers. I laid out about 6 or 7, and you heard them. The only thing we can agree on is police cameras.
So I'm really
because I would like
I just want to say, just a minute.
I would like
I'm
to
just
examine
really
those with you
disappointed
in
to
depth.
hear you say that. That's
I
all.
would like to examine
let's
those
let
with you
Mr.
in depth.
Loevy have an opportunity to respond, and then I know Mr. Mulhausen also wants to weigh in on this subject.
And just very quickly, I share the opinion that the body cameras can be helpful. I also share the opinion that it has to be used with the discretion so that those who want to give information to the police are not intimidated by it. We had hoped that when the cameras came into police cars, that would reduce the amount of violence, because at least some of the stops would be shown. In our experience, and it's anecdotal to be sure, 9 out of 10 accusations that we've dealt with where the violence took place in front of a squad car, in those instances, the camera was inoperative. Just happened to be broken back at the station. They just happened to not to be able to fix it. It's probably going to be the same reality with the body camera.
And of course, you're not vilifying police. I understand that. Just like Tim's not trying to vilify police either.
Mr.
Okay?
Mulhausen, wanted to
If you believe that, anybody, I've got some oceanfront property in Omaha, Nebraska to sell you at a real cheap price, okay?
All right, go ahead.
I think the use of body cameras need to be done sort of in a slow and incremental process. I would urge caution in adopting it nationwide, because I want to give you an example of a mandatory arrest for domestic violence. For years, when a police officer would show up at a household where there was domestic violence going on, they sort of let it be a family affair and didn't make an arrest. They did research in Minneapolis that did a randomized experiment, and they found that when you instituted mandatory arrests, what you found is that the individual who was arrested was less likely to engage in domestic violence in the future. And so that was a positive effect. Well, all across the country, cities and towns adopted mandatory arrest policies. And then when researchers did randomized experiments in other jurisdictions, they found that it had the opposite effect. That in Omaha, Nebraska, and Charlotte, North Carolina, they found that after the individual was arrested, the person was more likely to assault his partner because he knew he was going to go to jail once the call was made. And so, unfortunately, this is sort of sick, but he decided to, beat his spouse or girlfriend even more because he knew he was going to spend the night in jail no matter what. And so it backfired in that case. And so I think that we need to take sort of these changes in policing, or view them as sort of an experiment. Right now we sort of have an experiment going on with the increased use of body cameras. In some cases, as Mr. Woodson has said, it could backfire. And that's an important criticism. But so I think we shouldn't just rush to judgment and adopt body cameras in all police departments. I don't think it's actually going to happen. But we need to sort of look at it and sort of empirically assess what the effect is. And unfortunately, sometimes it takes years to actually assess whether or not a change in policy or a program is actually having the intended result. So, as always, as a researcher, I'm always urging caution, because sometimes our policies backfire and cause more harm than good.
Thank you. I feel a bit like a referee repping a boxing match here, but what I want to do is have the audience
Nobody's
members,
throwing any chairs yet.
Yes,
Joseph,
which is
so
good.
just-
But I want to have the audience members enter the fray a bit and see if they, make sure that they have an opportunity to participate as well. Yes, Roger.
Yes, Roger Pillen with the Cato Institute. Bob Woodson, your brief against vilification of the police misidentifies the issue. Tim Lynch and his colleague on the other side are not vilifying the police. They're vilifying criminal police. You're calling for prosecution of criminals in the communities in which you work. This is exactly what these other people are calling for. Prosecution of police criminals. That's not the same thing as vilification of police.
When Mr. Loevy offered a comment that 90% of the police cameras mounted on their cars suddenly weren't working, what is that? I want to know
It's a statement of fact, as I understand
That's
it.
vilification. That's an example of what I'm talking about.
But it's true.
Well,
It's true.
Yeah, wait a minute. You're implying that this is done
I wanna see the
purposely.
evidence of that.
Okay? You're implying that this is done purposely. Now, in
Nine out of
response
10,
to your, wait,
nine out
let
of
me
10.
respond to your question,
All right,
sir.
one at a time.
The Cato Institute wrote in November 2014 that it remains to be seen whether Officer Wilson will be held accountable at some future date. Accountable for what? The man was innocent. You talk about vilification? Why was that written? You don't know, do you?
Ask Tim, he's right beside
Yeah,
you.
I know. Well, that's what I want to find out. Why?
When the Justice Department report was issued, we immediately update all our stories.
Why
and
did
say-
you say in November 2014, after he was exonerated by the grand jury, that the man, in your opinion, was still guilty?
Don't attribute that to me. I didn't write
You
it.
talk about vilification. That's why.
No.
All right, let Mr.
I mean-
Lynch answer.
I mean, Mike is from Philadelphia. Again, is Chief John Timoney, he in his book wrote that when he took over the Philadelphia Police Department, he said the disciplinary process.
What's that got to do with what you wrote
Just a
about
minute.
Ferguson?
Let me
Just a
answer.
minute. He said
Don't change the
that the
subject.
disciplinary process in place in the Philadelphia Police Department was a joke. That's in his memoir. Now, John Timoney is not vilifying police. He's identifying problems in the police department to up their standards. I think you say...
Did I say Timothy vilified police?
I'm saying all
I'm talking about what you wrote.
criticism of police department procedures is not vilification. We have to differentiate.
You weren't
the two.
criticizing police procedures. You were saying this man was still guilty after he was exonerated. Why?
No. When he was exonerated by the Department of Justice, we promptly updated
When he was
it like
exonerated
all-
by the grand jury,
This
why?
is just a distraction.
No, you're the distraction.
All right.
You don't want to answer the
settle down.
question.
Let's move on to this fellow right here.
Sort of hesitate to jump in, but
Me too.
can't resist a good fight.
Sorry,
Clark Neely, Institute for Justice.
my apologies.
So
I am from
my
Philadelphia.
point I want to
We do
make is
talk
that
like this sometimes.
I think the most important thing from the standpoint of look, policing for a free people is a challenging job, but it's really important that people have faith in the integrity of that effort. And one of the things I've been a working constitutional lawyer for 15 years, and the thing I have found maybe most surprising in this area is the massive and inexplicable double standard between what other practitioners, I'm a lawyer, I can be sued. My sister's a doctor, she can be sued. The only vocation in this country where it's virtually impossible to sue its practitioners is law enforcement. Prosecutors have absolute immunity. Police officers have qualified immunity that makes it very difficult to sue them. And there's a Loevy article that came out last year that documented that 99.98% of all damage awards that are found against police are actually paid for by taxpayers, not even by the police officers. So I have a concrete policy proposal. I want to know what the panel thinks about it. What if we had police do what every other vocation does, which is to self-insure against lawsuits so that payments, the cost is internalized. If you work with a bunch of police officers who are constantly causing big damage judgments to come in, your premiums will be higher. And there will be a natural kind of tendency to self-correct and self-control because the more out of control your department is, the more it will cost you to insure, and that money will come out of your pocket instead of the taxpayer's pocket. The bad police officers will hopefully soon be forced off the job, but the good ones will continue to get the respect that they are absolutely entitled to for the difficult job that they do.
I have a better idea. If you get a bad cop, you put him in jail. That's all there is to it. Just like if you get a bad CEO, this idea of suing people and letting the insurance companies bear the brunt, that doesn't touch anybody. The only way you're going to do it is if you have somebody who's bad, you put them in jail.
So
That's where they
you
belong.
support the double standard where that law enforcement is the only vocation where it's difficult to sue
Well, I
people
mean,
for
how many
misconduct?
CEOs go skate free because they're the taxpayer, or rather the stockholder has to pay for these lawsuits. We saw it happen in 2007, 2008. They weren't held accountable for what they did.
Well, I have a feeling Mr. Loevy is going to want to respond to this.
By the way, I thought the idea advanced from the floor is a very good idea. But what Mike says is really what identifies the problem, I think, as clearly as anybody could. He says if it's a bad police officer, put him in jail. There is all kinds of bad, unconstitutional conduct that police officers or others governmental officials can engage in, do engage in, that is short of criminal conduct, but nevertheless, for the benefit of the citizenry, needs to be corrected. That's what civil law does. That's what the question from the floor indicated. Unfortunately, most police departments reach exactly Mike's conclusion. Either you did something so criminal you're going to jail, otherwise you're off the hook. There's a huge middle ground that needs to be addressed in order to make policemen and police departments more responsive.
Yes, and I hope everybody saw the front page Washington Post story about 2 weeks ago where local prosecutors indicted an officer for murder, and his attorneys went to court and said, well, he was part of a federal task force, and his status as a federal officer made him immune, legally immune from state homicide statutes, and the case was dismissed. The prosecutor has said that they're going to appeal that ruling, and so that is one to watch. So it's not as easy as saying, hey, he broke a law, send him to jail. There are these legal barriers in place, some of which are dubious and are unjustified.
Can those laws be changed?
All right,
Legal barriers, can they be removed?
Let's go to the back of the room for another question. Oh, right there. Yep.
I
Sorry
don't know if
about
there
that.
was
Not
a
the way
further back, right. So I'm always struck in conversations like this. I like to imagine that they're taking place in the late 20s, around the time of Prohibition, and we are all talking about, well, you know, the practices of the police, maybe they are focusing on hillbillies too much, or maybe they are being too, you know, they have too much discretion as to how many barrels to destroy. And instead, the problem was Prohibition. And so I don't know if it's beyond the scope of the conversation here, but I feel as though we're in this classic situation where what we've done is, in creating this enormous black market for 40 years, we've cultivated a scenario where police are naturally going to be in these terrible situations. The communities themselves are going to engage in this bad behavior, and right down to the arguments right in front of us on the panel, we've made this fight, and talking about you know, small reforms here and there are important, to be sure, but it would seem to me that the far bigger problem, the elephant in the room, is the drug war itself, and I haven't heard it mentioned. If you guys would want to talk about it, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
So we have a question about the drug war. Anyone want to respond to the questioner's comment?
Well, I would just say I agree that it is the root of many problems, but I think it is beyond the scope of this particular panel discussion.
All right, let's go to...
Thank you. I'd like to thank all of you for your very diverse perspectives, but especially thank the gentleman who spoke about vilification of the police. I understand that there were some recent articles that not only in the cities that you mentioned, but throughout the country, crime has gone up as a result of police being afraid to do their jobs in light of the recent vilification. I want to speak about a possible, see what people think of a possible reform that I haven't heard mentioned today, which is better police training. It seems like some of the deaths that occurred were really due to police not recognizing medical issues. Perhaps we need better training, recognizing when somebody is in medical distress. I also have a friend who's on the police force who says that police need better training in martial arts. Often martial arts are a way of bringing down somebody without having to resort to gunfire. And so that's a possible reform that it seems that could be very helpful and that everybody could agree to. I also wanted to ask you about the people behind these anti-police demonstrations and the total lawlessness of this. As you know, the policemen have been killed as a result of some of these demonstrations. It's really, unbelievable. I've been involved in organizing protests on other matters in New York City, and you have to get a permit when you normally organize a protest. You have to, you work with the police. You're restricted to a certain area. But however, the anti-police protests were just totally lawless. They were running through the streets, closing down traffic. People couldn't go anywhere for hours in the city. Obviously the Baltimore situation was even worse than it was in New York City. And who is behind this? It seems also that some of these lawless protests were very well organized. In Ferguson and so on. And there were also other groups involved. For instance, we noticed anti-Semitic posters in these protests. So do any of you have an idea of who is really behind financing and inciting some of these some of these protests, which have been completely lawless and resulted in violence and property damage and so on?
Well, let's take the negligent training or the training of officers issue first, and then we'll take the latter.
Yeah, just a quick reform that we have been advocating, and that is a lot of police officers are promoted if they make a felony arrest, which a lot of times it means violent encounters. But there are some also very good police officers who prevent violence by positive interactions with the police. Somehow that person should also that should count towards promotion and elevation as well.
Agreed.
If I can make a brief comment, I agree, of course, about training. We're litigating a case now in which a 97-year-old World War II vet in a nursing home had a knife in his hand and was shot and killed by the police when they arrived at the request of the nursing home. What really, it seems to me, needed to be done was the police needed better training on how to disengage someone, talk someone down. Obviously, no policeman should not be able to protect himself when he or she is in danger. But there is a skill that, in our judgment at least, should have been used to talk down a 97-year-old man that was in a nursing home in his kitchen, and when there were other mental health people on the premises who could have helped. So training is indeed a factor. I think most police departments, in their more reflective moments, realize that there's a lot that could be done.
It's very difficult to establish a training regimen that would cover just about every situation. And it's, I hear martial arts a lot. I've studied Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Aikido and some other things over the years. And as you might have heard, I used to coach wrestling. Even at that, if I would have applied some of those techniques, it would have caused injury to the person I was trying to apprehend. There is no one silver bullet that would solve every situation, especially when you're dealing with people who are mentally ill. And it's really, really difficult to do that. So I just don't, I don't know what the answer is there.
Now, it may be beyond the scope of the panel, but I want to give you a chance to respond. She also brought up the protests that have been occurring over the last year or two. Does anyone want to respond to that?
I think Black Lives Matters has been one of the most destructive forces around. It has no purpose but to protest. I'm a veteran of the civil rights movement. We had, I think, laudatory goals. It was oriented towards solutions. What is their solution? And again, Black Lives seems to only matter when a white person is taking a black life and not when a little girl gets shot through the head sitting on her grandfather's lap. When they can rise up and protest when that occurs, then I will join them.
All right, let's go to the back of the room.
Okay, I know that you've been talking about how it feels like the police have each other's back. Sometimes I wonder to what extent it also feels like the judiciary has the police's back. And I'm talking specifically about the heightened pleading requirements. To what extent do we end up shielding municipal entities and counties that should have made some really good decisions on the front end from continuing to make bad decisions, because we basically are shielding them from liability through the judicial process?
Thoughts on the judicial process and how it plays into some of these questions about policing?
Well, it plays in some ways. One of the speakers pointed out, policemen have immunity from being sued. It's a qualified immunity. Prosecutors, judges have an absolute immunity. They can never be sued. Part of the problem is municipalities insure themselves. Part of the problem is that the municipalities can pay a judgment even for errant police officers, even when they know they've done wrong, short of criminal conduct, even when they've engaged in criminal conduct. And what happens is they pay the compensatory damages. Just real quickly, a policeman can be sued punitively to give a warning to other police officers they can't engage in the same kind of conduct in the future. It can punish him for his bad acts. And again, and I'm speaking anecdotally, I don't have statistics, but anecdotally, every time we get a punitive damage against a police officer, the department puts pressure on the municipality to say, as part of the settlement, person that you're suing, this is not the lawyer, this is our client, you can get all that money as long as you don't collect it directly from the policeman. It is very unusual in the civil litigation under Section 1983, extremely unusual for a policeman ever to pay anything out of his own pocket. What happens is the municipality steps up. The more subtle problem is, quite often, it is the supervisory personnel in a department that are really responsible by the instructions they've given. Everybody falls on the sword in most, and again, anecdotally, but in most of this litigation, the patrolman takes the responsibility for the sergeant takes it for the lieutenant for the captain from the chief, knowing that at the end of the day, they're never really going to be hurt by it. I hope that answers the question, at least in part.
All right, I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative here and ask a question that I hope that was going to be asked but hasn't been asked yet, which is there are differing views on the panel about the needs for reform and what that reform looks like. But I want to ask a more sort of fundamental Federalist question, which is where does the reform need to come from, if reform is necessary? Does it come from the national government, the state government, the local governments, or all of the above?
I would say all of the above.
I'd like to add, I think that, state policing is inherently a state and local issue, and it needs to be governed by the jurisdictions that are responsible for providing those services. And I think the federal government is more likely to impose a one-system-fits-all solution that may not work across this varied land that we live in. And so I would stress we need to have sort of a maybe outdated, but a view that this is a view that federalism means that there are certain responsibilities that are entirely reserved to state and local governments and not to the federal government. And so I see this as a local issue, and as for terms of the federal government, it should play very little role, if any.
Yeah, but David, then you...
I agree, and I think that we should look for reforms. Camden, New Jersey, for instance, used to have one of the most corrupt and most ineffective. They've made some major reforms where police officers are actually living in the communities where they're serving and there's just been some positive community interaction. Violence is down. Police relationships are good. Franklin Township in New Jersey, where the chief has met with local citizens. So if there is an incident involving the police, the call doesn't go to New York to demonstrators, but it goes to some local leaders who are able to convene and explain to citizens what happened. So there's some positive models of reform, but it should come, I think, from the local. But we ought to have somebody spend some of the time, particularly some of these research institutes, on what works in terms of community police reform. Where are the studies of successful police-community interaction?
David, in your opinion, do you feel that because of the nature of the politics between city and state, that sometimes you do need the federal government to come in?
I think it should be extremely rare occasions.
Yeah, I mean, we saw that during the civil rights era where it was necessary to do that.
I think there are some cases, but broadly speaking, the federal government should not play a major role. And I think that for those of you who are interested in looking at what the best available research says about various topics in policing, I'm not affiliated with this organization, but the Center for Evidence-Based Policing at George Mason University does excellent research. I highly recommend the work that they do for looking at what works in policing.
Without existing federal law and law as at Section 1983 and the way that it has been interpreted by the Supreme Court, without those laws, there would be virtually, let me put it differently. It would be extremely difficult for a citizen, an individual citizen, to get redress from police misconduct. The very viable remedy that is available to them is available under federal law. Without federal law, citizens would be dependent on state court remedies, and historically they have been inadequate. So the federal government does have a role to play. Section 1983, Section 1988, been on the books for a long time, and I think that they have provided an effective watchdog and effective oversight on police misconduct.
Mr. Lynch?
In the weeks after the death of Freddie Gray, when Baltimore was all over the news, pressure began to build to bring in the Department of Justice, and eventually the mayor of Baltimore did invite Loretta Lynch and the Department of Justice to come in and investigate the city police department. And so that investigation is now ongoing, and I expect in a few weeks, it could be 2 weeks, it might be 3 more months, but the Department of Justice, I expect, is going to issue a report saying that there's a pattern and practice of problems in the Baltimore Police Department. And, you know, it's really not going to be any surprise, but a lot of people are surprised when I say that that was a mistake by Mayor Rawlings to bring in the Department of Justice. I think when there was all that national attention, there was no better time for her to make the corrections that a lot of people thought were necessary in that city police department. The environment is never going to be better than it was back then when there was so much attention and scrutiny on that department. So the Department of Justice is going to issue a report in a couple of months, and I'm sure the mayor will hold a press conference with the police chief, and they'll pledge their cooperation and follow through with the reforms, and we'll see what happens. But my point is that sometimes the local officials shift off the responsibility for cleaning up their own police department by inviting the Department of Justice in and to let them handle it, let them make the tough decisions. And I think it should be done by the mayor and the chief of police.
Thank you. Let's go back to the front of the room for another question.
Yes, my name is Bill Otis. I'm an adjunct professor of law at Georgetown. The question has been raised by the panel whether police misconduct sparks distrust of the police, and that distrust in turn undermines law enforcement. The question whether the police and other major public institutions enjoy the public's trust has actually been polled by Gallup. Gallup polls it every year. In its most recent poll, that was just taken last month, it was a poll of 15 institutions The leading two institutions were the military and small business. Coming in number 3 were the police, with 52% trust. By contrast, the president enjoyed 32% trust, the Supreme Court 31%, and TV News 21%. In other words, the principal organizations that you hear calling for police reform enjoy about half the trust of the police themselves. The reason that they enjoy that level of trust is that they have largely adopted what has become the motto of the anti-police movement, that is, hands up, don't shoot. It's no longer news that hands up, don't shoot is false, that his hands weren't up and he was not trying to surrender. What is news is that the media and anti-police organizations continue to adopt what they know is a false motto as the anthem of their movement. And a movement that takes root in a knowing falsehood deserves all the amount of trust that we would give, for example, to something like, if you like your insurance, you can keep your insurance.
The motto in poor communities today is nothing to do with your hands up. It's don't put your hands in your pants, because that's what results in shooting. The issue of broad surveys of police, and I'm glad it's like that, has nothing to do with the reality of high crime communities. In high crime communities, and again, it's more anecdotal, but I think it's true. In high crime communities, there's an intense distrust of the police. Why is there a distrust of the police? Because the police in the high crime communities do the stop and frisk. Their issue is not only to reduce crime, it is to make, and this is what really is going on, is to make a social statement, much like the social statement that the last speaker just made. You have to respect me, you have to respect authority, you have to be in a position that if a policeman tells you to do something, asks you to do something, you can't wise off, you can't exercise even a constitutional right to do it. You, the police, are someone that has to be listened to. It is not an accident that law-abiding, decent, fine people in high-crime communities won't talk to the police. And it's not just because they're being intimidated by gang members and other bad people. It's because the police in those communities have not been trained very well and have taken the exact same kind of an attitude that some at least have presented, that we can do what we want because we represent justice, the citizens do not. And that, I think, is what's going on.
Well,
Thank you, brother.
the data doesn't bear that out, Arthur. DGS, I just quoted a bureau, maybe perhaps you didn't hear it. It was a 2011 study which said that the majority of people do approve of the way the police do their jobs, and there was no discernible difference between Hispanics, blacks, and whites. There are Gallup surveys that do the same thing, and other surveys that do as well. And Bob, go ahead, Bob, you were going to say.
It shouldn't be a majority, it should be 99%.
Well, it was 93%, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead, Bob.
The point is, people in those high crime communities want increased police. If you look at any study of those communities, they want increased, but they're the ones who are losing the children. And they want, it's just not true what you're saying. That the surveys of people in those high crime areas, more of them desire increased police presence in their community. That's what the demand is.
From the chiefs of police to the officers on the street, their biggest complaint in trying to solve crime is that people are not coming forward to help us.
Well, that was the same.
Well, the reason, let me finish if I may. That
was the same issue in the Italian American communities 100 years ago, Arthur. That was the same. That was the same thing in Italian American communities. Now, look, there is no doubt in my mind that there's more interaction with police on use of force, either non-fatal or fatal use of force by police in the African American community. There's no doubt about that. The question we have to answer is why. And people who are interested in criminal justice reform, true criminal justice reform, need to answer that question. If I say to you, what ethnic group, if I say the term organized crime, and I say to you, what ethnic group would you associate? Anybody who says anything other than Italian is lying, okay? And I'm Italian, all right? Question is, why were Italians so much involved in organized crime? Okay? Nobody really answers that question. And these are the questions that need to be answered, and you can't have reform until you have some kind of idea of what you want to reform and why and what causes them. To have anecdotal information, well, in your opinion, blacks don't talk to cops because they're afraid of the police. That's maybe your experience. That's not mine as a police officer, and that's certainly not Bob's. And guess what? Bob happens to be African American.
Arthur's gets the last word here because we have to wrap it up.
You spoke over me. What I was about to say, what I did say is, police complain regularly, from the chief to the guy on the street, that communities, high-crime communities, do not have sufficient cooperation from the citizens in those communities. What I was about to say was we can disagree about the reasons. One of those reasons, not the only reason, one of those reasons is the fact that police in many high-crime communities have abused their authority and their power. Now, you can deny that takes place, but it is an element, and I believe that very strongly.
Well, you're going to have to show the proof.
Hang on. I'm told that we have to wrap up. It's 2:15. I apologize to those standing at the microphones that we didn't have time for your questions, but please give a nice round of applause for these very passionate panelists.